This is another podcast from Alpha Business Media. Welcome to the Deep Dive. When we talk about agriculture, it's often called the backbone of a nation. And in Nepal, well, it really truly is. Just think about this, something like 62% of households there depend on farming for their livelihood.
It's a huge proportion.
It is. But here's the puzzle, the really interesting part. Despite agriculture being so central to people's lives, its actual share of Nepal's economy, the GDP, has plummeted.
Plummeted is right, from almost half the economy down to, 24% by 2022?
Exactly. So you've got this sector that's fundamental, but also, well, in a deep crisis. And the government sees this, right? They've launched these big state programs aiming for a turnaround in 2025.
Significant programs, major investments.
But the big question we're digging into today is, are these ambitious programs, these subsidies, loans, insurance schemes, are they actually reaching the small farmers who need them most? Or have they maybe unintentionally created layers and layers of complexity? Red tape, confusion. Has it become less of a helping hand and more of a labyrinth?
A labyrinth. That's a good way to put it. And that's what we're trying to unpack for you, the listener. We're looking at detailed analyses, studies on how these programs are really working on the ground.
Giving you that shortcut to understanding what's going on.
Precisely.
Uh,
Because there's this paradox, isn't there? High reliance, declining economic share. So what's driving it? Well, the sources point to a few key things. First, mass labor migration.
Young people leaving.
Yes, huge numbers leaving rural areas, often going abroad for work. This creates serious labor shortages back home, and it particularly impacts women who are often left running the farms, the so-called feminization of agriculture.
Which means land might not even get cultivated.
Exactly. Land left fallow. And then for those who do stay and farm, they're often using, traditional methods. Not very efficient.
On small plots of land, too, right?
Yeah.
Fragmented holding.
Tiny plots, yeah. Often terraced hillsides. Totally unsuited for big modern machinery. Then you add in poor market access. It's hard to sell what you grow. Weak infrastructure, like irrigation canals or roads. And then there's the massive vulnerability to climate change.
Droughts, floods. We hear about that constantly.
Devastating impacts. So it all feeds into this vicious cycle. Farmers feel demotivated. Farming gets this low social status. More people leave, which increases costs and risks for those remaining, which lowers income further.
And the end result.
Nepal, an agricultural nation, actually has to import food. It's quite striking.
So the government programs are meant to break that cycle, make farming viable again.
That's the intention. Make it attractive, modernize it. Our mission today, using these sources, is to see if they're pulling it off or if they've inadvertently built that labyrinth we talked about.
Okay, let's kick off with the big one, the flagship program, the Prime Minister Agriculture Modernization Project, PMMP.
PMP, launched 2016, huge scale, a 10-year plan, budget around US $1.12 billion.
$1 billion. That's serious money. And the goals are equally ambitious, aren't they?
Oh, yeah. Game-changing modernization, commercialization, mechanization, aiming for self-sufficiency in key crops.
And the way they structured it, on paper anyway, seems logical, dividing the country into zones.
Yes, pockets, blocks, zones, and super zones. The idea is to specialize like a super zone just for rice, or a zone focused on potatoes, maybe a block for dairy.
Concentrating resources, getting economies of scale. Makes sense.
It does, in theory, but what's really fascinating, a bit concerning, is how often that neat top-down design clashes with the reality farmers actually face.
So the results are mixed.
Very mixed, according to the studies. You do see pockets of success, absolutely. For instance, one study looked at a potato zone in Bashang
Okay.
and found technical efficiency was high, nearly 88%, which sounds great, right?
Yeah, that sounds like progress.
But, and this is the crucial part, those same studies found that even in these relatively successful areas, PMEP often failed to fix the fundamental problems it was supposed to address.
Like what?
Things like, still having poor access to credit, or not getting enough support from agricultural experts, agronomists. The project might deliver some seeds or tools.
And not the whole package.
Exactly, not the underlying support system. Another study, this one in a maize zone in Parbat, found something similar. Most farmers, like 89% surveyed, said yes, they got better access to inputs, better seeds, maybe those mini cultivators.
That's positive.
It is. But critical things, like reliable access to irrigation, still a massive problem for most. So you get the seed, but if you can't water it properly, the impact is limited, you see.
Right. Getting one piece of the puzzle doesn't help if another crucial piece is missing. It feels disconnected.
It really does. And this highlights, I think, a deeper issue. Historically, Nepalese agricultural policy has tended to favor the plains, the Terai region. It's easier to farm on a large scale there, maybe easier to access.
But most farmers aren't there.
Yeah. No. Most smallholders, that 62% we started with, they live in the hills. Diverse landscapes, challenging conditions, and PMP's big, centralized, sort of top-down structure. It struggles to adapt to that reality.
So the model doesn't fit the terrain, essentially.
It seems that way. The billion-dollar budget and the grand goals don't automatically translate into flexible, effective help for a farmer on a small hillside terrace. And then there's the issue of how the money gets distributed.
Ah, you mentioned political influence earlier. Is that a factor here?
It seems to be. The sources suggest that this centralized funding model makes PMP vulnerable. Support sometimes gets steered towards people with connections or concentrated in those easier-to-reach plain areas.
Not necessarily to the farmers who need it most in remote regions?
Precisely. So the design that was meant to bring order and focus can end up creating this implementation labyrinth where the small farmer's actual needs get lost in the system.
Okay, so PMP is complex. Let's look at another pillar. Subsidies. You mentioned staggering figures earlier.
Yes, the numbers are huge. Over the last 5 fiscal years we look at, the government poured 107 billion Nepalese rupees into agricultural subsidies.
107 billion. It's hard to even grasp that scale. Where did most of it go?
The vast majority, 81% actually, so about 87 billion rupees, went solely on chemical fertilizers.
Wow. Heavily skewed towards fertilizer then.
Very much so. The rest, around 20 billion, went through various projects. PMMP was the biggest channel for that non-fertilizer part, handling about 6.6 billion of it.
And these subsidies cover more than just fertilizer, right? Machinery, insurance.
That's right. They cover about 50% of the cost for buying agricultural machinery and up to 80% of the premium for agricultural insurance.
The idea being lower the cost, encourage farmers to modernize and protect themselves. Seems straightforward.
It sounds like direct, powerful help. And yet, the consistent finding from reports and studies is that the effectiveness, especially for reaching small farmers, is extremely low.
Despite the billions spent.
Despite the billions. For years, it's not just whispers. There's documented evidence and widespread complaints that this aid isn't getting to the intended recipients.
It gets diverted.
Often, yes. It ends up with larger players, maybe agro-businesses, or those at the political pole. The problem is so well known that the Minister of Agriculture himself, as the sources note, publicly acknowledged violations.
He admitted there's misuse.
Yes, and apparently is setting up a commission to investigate it. That tells you something about the scale of the problem. It's not just a few isolated cases.
So there's a huge issue with the money flow. Let's call that the access labyrinth and the implementation labyrinth for subsidies. Is that the only problem, though?
Unfortunately, no. Beyond the challenges of getting the money to the right people, there's a fundamental policy contradiction. This is a perfect example of what we could call the policy labyrinth.
Okay, explain that.
Think about mechanization. The government subsidizes buying new tractors and machinery, making that initial purchase cheaper.
Good, right.
And they have a really low import tax on new tractors, just 1%, to encourage bringing them in.
Seems logical for modernization.
It does. But then, let's say your subsidized tractor breaks down. You need a spare part. Or maybe you need a specific attachment later on.
Yeah.
Suddenly, you're hit with really high import duties on those parts and attachments. 15% tax plus a 13% VAT.
Wait, so it's cheap to buy the whole tractor but expensive to fix it?
Exactly. It's incredibly expensive and difficult to maintain and repair the machine over its life. Who does that system really benefit?
The importers selling new tractors, I guess, not the farmer.
Precisely. It benefits the sellers of new units, not the farmer left with broken, unusable equipment they can't afford to fix. And the sources document this expensive, subsidized machinery just sitting idle, underutilized.
That completely undermines the goal, doesn't it? You want machines to be used, maintained, to last.
Absolutely. It also cripples things like those custom hiring centers that are supposed to rent out equipment. Their repair costs become prohibitively high because parts are taxed so heavily. So the whole subsidy system pushes the initial purchase, but actively discourages long-term sustainable use.
It's a policy working against itself. A maze where you buy the machine but get trapped when it needs a fix.
A perfect example of that fragmentation labyrinth, too. The subsidy policy isn't connected to the trade and tax policy or the need for affordable repairs.
Okay, let's move to another critical area. Access to capital. Loans. Farmers need money to invest, right?
absolutely essential, especially for modernization or just getting through a tough season. The main bank here is the Agricultural Development Bank, ADBL. They have specific loans, like for buying tools.
And the government has that subsidized loan program, too.
Yes, the Salyapurna Karja program, that's the flagship. And on paper, the interest rates look pretty good. Well, they're linked to the bank's base rate, which for ADBL was around 6%, maybe a bit more recently, plus a small premium. So maybe an equipment loan might be around 9%, and the subsidized program makes it even cheaper than that.
So significantly lower than typical market rates.
Definitely. Other banks offer agricultural loans too, often similar rates. It sounds like a real effort to make financing affordable.
But I sense a but coming.
You sense right. This is probably where the access labyrinth hits hardest for most small farmers. The research is just overwhelming and consistent on this.
What are the barriers?
They're huge. First, the application process. It's complex, bureaucratic, takes forever, involves tons of paperwork. Really intimidating for someone maybe not used to dealing with banks.
The red tape?
Exactly. Then collateral. Banks demand high levels of collateral, security against the loan. Small farmers often only own their small plot of land, which might not be enough, or they lack formal title deeds.
So they don't have what the bank wants.
Often, no. And on top of that, there's a general reluctance from many banks to even lend to agriculture. They just see it as too risky. Weather, pests, market prices.
So what happens to these farmers who can't get through the formal system?
They get pushed towards informal lenders, local money lenders, sometimes friends or relatives, but the terms there are usually much, much harsher.
Higher interest rates, predatory terms.
Exorbitant interest rates, yeah. It traps them in cycles of debt they can't escape, and it means they can't make those investments in fertilizer, better seeds, or machinery that the government ostensibly wants them to make.
So the formal system, meant to help, actually ends up pushing them into worse situations.
In many cases, yes. And there's another twist to this maze. Even when the subsidized loan money is given out by the banks, it doesn't always get used for farming.
Well, ways to go.
A study by Nepal's central bank, Nepal Rashtra Bank, found that over 30% of these cheap agricultural loans were actually diverted.
Diverted where?
Into other things the borrower thought were more profitable, like trade, buying goods to sell, maybe real estate or housing, not used for the intended agricultural purpose at all.
So who is getting these loans then?
It creates this really unfair two-tiered system. You have people who are well-informed, maybe better connected, who can figure out the bureaucracy and access this cheap government money. But they then use it for personal profit elsewhere.
Well, the small farmers.
The small farmers, the ones the program is supposedly for, they can't navigate the system, can't meet the collateral demands, and they stay stuck with expensive informal debt, unable to invest. The formal loan system becomes part of the problem, not the solution.
Okay, let's talk about insurance. Given Nepal's climate vulnerability, floods, droughts, you name it, insurance feels like it should be absolutely critical.
It really should be a vital safety net. And again, on paper, the government support looks incredibly generous. They subsidize 80% of the premium.
80%, that's huge.
Massive subsidy for coverage up to 5 million rupees per farmer. And the policies cover a lot: weather damage, pests, diseases, even damage from wildlife, which is a real issue in some areas.
And they're trying to modernize it too.
Yes, the regulator, NIA, is trying. They're planning a new digital platform, ALIs, and looking at special programs for areas where farming conflicts with wildlife conservation, trying to adapt.
So high subsidy, broad coverage, modernization efforts, you'd expect farmers to be signing up in droves.
You would think so, but the reality, especially for crop insurance, the system is almost non-functional on the ground. The actual uptake, the number of farmers covered, is extremely low.
Why, if it's so heavily subsidized?
It boils down to a profound crisis of trust, what we could call the mistrust labyrinth. Many farmers either don't even know the insurance exists, or if they do, they simply don't trust the insurance companies or the system to actually pay out if something goes wrong.
And is that mistrust justified?
Sadly, yes. The sources make it clear this mistrust is earned. Filing a claim is incredibly complicated. Lots of forms, proof needed, inspections. It's a huge hassle.
And payouts are slow.
Painfully slow. It can take months, sometimes even years, to get compensation. In fact, the government recently had to step in and allocate 800 million rupees just to clear old unpaid claims that insurance companies owed to farmers.
Wow. So that confirms the delays are real. If you can't rely on it paying when you desperately need it after a disaster, Why bother paying even the 20% premium?
Exactly. Why bother with the paperwork? And their attempt to fix this with digitalization, that ALI's
Yeah,
platform.
is that making it better?
Well, looking at the
Oh, yeah.
description, it might actually create a digital labyrinth. Think about it from the perspective of a rural farmer, maybe someone with limited digital skills or unreliable internet.
Okay.
You have to register online, get an OTP code on your phone, fill out detailed forms, pinpoint your farm plots on a digital map, submit requests, wait for technicians, more forms, upload documents.
That sounds daunting.
It seems almost impossible for many rural farmers without massive amounts of local support and training, which often isn't available. It risks excluding the very people who need it most.
So technology isn't a magic bullet if the access isn't there.
Right. And there's another design flaw, too. Why is livestock insurance a bit more popular than crop insurance?
I don't know. Why?
Because assessing the loss is simpler. An animal is either alive or dead. It's pretty clear-cut. But crops, assessing partial damage from, say, a bit less rain than usual, or a pest infestation that reduces yield but doesn't wipe it out completely.
That's much harder to measure accurately.
Much harder, much more subjective. Requires expert assessment, potential for disputes. The current crop insurance systems just aren't really designed to handle these partial nuanced losses easily or cheaply. So it's unattractive for insurers due to the hassle and cost, and difficult for farmers to prove their losses.
Leaving crops, the main income source for most, largely unprotected in practice.
That's the reality, despite the 80% subsidy, broken by complexity, delays, and that deep lack of trust.
Okay, let's shift to mechanization and technology again. Using machines is key to boosting productivity. And the main model is these custom hiring centers, CHCs.
Yes, the idea is farmers who can't afford their own tractor or mini cultivator can rent one from a local CHC. The government supports setting these up and subsidizes the equipment they buy.
Especially smaller machines for the hills.
Exactly. Mini cultivators, power tillers that are better suited to terraced farming. And we are seeing some exciting tech being piloted, like those agricultural drones for spraying pesticides or fertilizers.
That sounds genuinely modern, saves time, right?
Huge time saver. Sources say a drone can spray an acre in maybe 5-7 minutes versus 4 hours doing it manually with a backpack sprayer. Plus, it's potentially safer for the farmer and uses fewer chemicals. Rental services are starting to pop up.
So some positive signs on the tech front.
The potential is there. But again, implementation hits that implementation labyrinth and the fragmentation labyrinth. Even PMP's own reports admit many CHCs are performing poorly.
Why aren't they working well?
Reviews by organizations like the FAO point to a lack of sustainable business plans. They don't know how to run it like a business. Poor management training. No clear guidelines on operations, repairs, pricing.
So they just become places that hand out subsidized machines.
Often, yes. They get the equipment, maybe distribute it, but there's no real plan or capacity for keeping it running, maintaining it, repairing it when it breaks down. And this is where that fragmentation effect we've been talking about really comes into focus. It shows how these different failures connect and trap the farmer.
Give us the picture again.
Okay, imagine the farmer. Maybe, finally, they get access to a subsidized mini cultivator through a CHC or directly. Feels like progress.
It's snelling.
Then it breaks, which machines do. Now, remember our discussion about subsidies. Getting spare parts is incredibly expensive because of those high import taxes. That's the policy labyrinth hitting them.
Right, the parts cost a fortune.
So maybe they need a loan to buy the part or pay for the repair. But then they hit the bank and face all that bureaucracy, the collateral demands, the access labyrinth again.
Okay, I see the connection.
And on top of all that, maybe they weren't even properly trained on how to operate or maintain the machine in the first place, because comprehensive training wasn't included when they got the subsidized machine.
So the programs are all working in silos. They're not connected.
Exactly. The subsidy program gives the machine, but it's not linked to affordable repair financing. It's actually contradicted by the tax policy on parts. And it's disconnected from the necessary training.
A farmer needs the whole package, not just one piece.
They need a complete ecosystem of support. The machine, affordable parts, access to repair funds, the knowledge to use and maintain it. The failure to connect these pieces is what turns these well-intentioned programs into a frustrating, often impassable maze for the very farmers they're supposed to help.
So let's bring it all together, back to our core question. Are these agricultural programs in Nepal a labyrinth, or are they real help? Our deep dive into these sources suggests, well, it's complicated.
It really is both, in a way. The potential for help is definitely there. You see it in the government's stated goals, the huge amounts of money allocated, They want to modernize agriculture and improve food security.
The intentions are good.
The intentions seem good, but for the vast majority of small farmers, the people who truly are the backbone of Nepalese agriculture, the current reality, according to these sources, is that these programs function mostly as a labyrinth.
A maze, you called it.
Of what?
A maze of inaccessibility, of inefficiency, and often a maze leading to unintended injustice.
And this labyrinth has different sections, different dimensions.
Yes, the sources reveal several clear overlapping dimensions. There's the access labyrinth, the bureaucracy, the complex rules, the collateral demands that just shut out the most vulnerable farmers from getting loans, subsidies, or insurance.
Okay.
Then there's the implementation labyrinth, that gap between the stated goals and the budget and what actually happens on the ground. Misuse of funds, support centers like CHCs that don't really function, programs that fail to tackle core problems like irrigation.
Right. We also saw the policy labyrinth, those internal contradictions. The classic example being taxing spare parts while subsidizing the initial machine purchase, which undermines the whole goal of sustainable use. And crucially, the deep mistrust labyrinth. That lack of faith farmers have in the system, earned through years of complexity, delays, and broken promises, especially clear with the insurance problems.
And you mentioned fragmentation.
Yes, the fragmentation labyrinth kind of ties it all together. It shows how individual programs fail because they aren't integrated. You need policy, finance, technology, training, market access, all working together. Right now, they seem to operate in separate boxes, leaving the farmer trying to navigate between them.
So just throwing more money at these separate boxes probably isn't the answer. What do the sources suggest is the way out? How do you find a path through this labyrinth?
The consensus points towards a really fundamental shift, moving away from this fragmented, top-down, maybe centrally designed approach.
Towards what?
Towards building a genuinely holistic, farmer-centric support system, an ecosystem. It's less about just injecting more funds and more about rethinking how the support is designed and delivered based on what farmers actually need.
Any specific recommendations?
Yes, several key things come through. First, radically simplify everything. Make the processes for getting loans, subsidies, insurance genuinely easy and accessible, maybe using local cooperatives, maybe better digital tools, but ones designed with and for farmers.
So to update.
Drastically. Second, integrate the support. So if you get a subsidized machine, it must come with proper, accessible training on how to use it, maintain it, maybe even basic business skills for managing it.
Makes sense.
Third, fix those policy contradictions. Get rid of illogical things like the high import tax on essential spare parts. Make policies coherent.
Okay.
Fourth, empower local actors. Strengthen those custom hiring centers with clear guidelines. Help them develop sustainable business models, maybe give more control and ownership to local farmer groups who understand the context.
More bottom-up involvement.
Exactly. And finally, rebuild trust. That requires radical transparency, showing clearly where subsidy money goes. And it means ensuring insurance claims are handled quickly, fairly, and simply. Prove the system works.
So it's really about fixing the system, not just patching holes, weaving those threads together: policy, finance, tech, training, local capacity. Only then can government support become a real tool, not a maze.
That seems to be the clear message from the analysis, transforming the labyrinth into a pathway.
Thinking about everything we've discussed, here's a final, maybe provocative thought for you to consider. How many other well-intentioned government programs in different sectors and different countries, designed centrally with big goals and budgets, end up creating similar labyrinths when they actually hit the complex, diverse reality on the ground? That wraps up our deep dive into Nepal's agricultural support programs. We really hope this exploration has given you a clearer understanding of the immense challenges, but also the potential pathways forward for this vital sector. Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive. We trust it's provided you with a solid grasp of a really complex, important issue.